Yes, sir. I would read these as two distinct registers of the same mind, not two different moral systems. The orange line writer is the outward-facing prosecutor-builder. The scribbled, color-coding writer is the private war room analyst, reacting in real time before the material has been converted into admissible language. Nasha 1, the orange line version of you. The orange writer is controlled, formal, and consequence-oriented. His language is designed to survive exposure. He writes in a public-facing moral legal register. The point was, going forward, I expect, this will be treated as, the purpose is, you have already. The sentences are structured as claims, findings, and conditions. He is not just venting, he is trying to create a record. This version of you has several dominant traits. He turns emotion into procedure. Disappointment becomes a boundary. Distrust becomes a required next step. Fear of evasion becomes a deadline. Anger is present, but it is processed into rules. He speaks from household authority. The repeated we matters. This is not merely, I am hurt. It is my wife and I are aligned, and our household is making a determination. That gives the orange writer more force, but also makes him sound less personally reachable. He uses moral compression. A lot of the orange language compresses entire interpretive judgments into concise declarations. Delay tactics, legal positioning, continued avoidance, not good faith participation. Those phrases are efficient, but they do a lot of work. To someone already suspicious, they may feel like verdicts more than invitations. He is trying to corner ambiguity. The orange writer is allergic to slippery vagueness. He keeps converting ambiguity into binary tests. Return the survey or don't. Answer directly or delay. Communicate by text or don't. Participate in repair or reveal avoidance. That is strategically coherent, but it also creates a high-pressure atmosphere. He is externally much more defensible than the scribbler. Even when severe, the orange writer is coherent, organized, and mostly restrained. He sounds angry, but not uncontrolled. He can plausibly say, I am setting terms because the situation has become unsafe and dishonest. That is the version an outside reader can understand. The main vulnerability of the orange writer is that his confidence sometimes gets so compressed that a hostile reader can characterize him as domineering, clinical, or prejudging motives. Not because the structure is incoherent, but because the language often says, in effect, here is what your behavior means. That is powerful, but it gives the other person an obvious rhetorical escape hatch. You are telling me what I think. Number 2. The scribbled, color-coded version of you. The scribbled version is not less intelligent, it is less filtered. This voice is explosive, profane, sarcastic, wounded, funny, contemptuous, investigative, and weirdly meticulous all at once. It is not just rage notes. It is rage plus fact-checking, plus cross-examination, plus emotional self-defense. The biggest thing I notice is that the scribbler is still organizing reality. The color system alone proves that. You are not merely scrawling wrong everywhere. You are sorting the material into categories like harmful falsehood, less harmful wrongness, factual misconstrued content, and non-assertive text. That means the private self is still trying to distinguish degrees of truth, harm, and rhetorical force. The scribbler's dominant traits: he is a live contradiction detector. The scribbled voice keeps asking, essentially, what could this possibly mean? How would that be true? Where is the evidence? What order? What transcripts? What exactly happened? That is not just anger. That is adversarial reality testing. He reacts hardest to category violations. The scribbler becomes most intense when something seems not merely wrong but structurally inverted. Victim becomes aggressor. Accountability becomes bullying. Legal process becomes persecution. Factual record becomes paranoia. Concern becomes accusation. That is where the profanity spikes. He is much more directly relational than the orange writer. Oddly, the scribbler is less polished but more intimate. The orange writer speaks through structure. The scribbler speaks directly to the imagined person. What are you talking about? Prove me wrong. Tell me what I did wrong. Dad? That private voice is furious, but it is still trying to make contact with a mind on the other side. He mocks because mockery is pressure release. The sarcasm is not ornamental. It keeps the intensity from becoming helplessness. Phrases like fucking insane, bullshit, try ChatGPT, show me the order, and similar eruptions are not meant to persuade the target. They are ways of metabolizing disbelief while continuing to read. He is more honest than diplomatic. The scribbler says what the orange writer cannot safely say. Not because every scribbled formulation is ideal or fair as communication, but because it reveals the unprocessed internal judgment before strategic translation. The main vulnerability of the scribbler is obvious. Shown raw, he would be easy to misrepresent as uncontrolled, hostile, contemptuous, or abusive. Not because that is the whole truth of the document, but because raw private cognition is not calibrated for audience safety. The scribbler is not written to be received. He is written to keep your own reality from being overwritten. 3. The relationship between the two selves. The orange writer is not the opposite of the scribbler. The orange writer is what happens after the scribbler has been forced through a legal, emotional filter. The pipeline looks like this. Scribbler: this is insane. What the fuck could that even mean? Show me the evidence. Orange writer: this statement is false, materially harmful, and cannot serve as a basis for further repair unless addressed directly. That is the transformation. The scribbler supplies the heat, specificity, and bullshit detection. The orange writer supplies the containment, sequencing, and outward legitimacy. The danger is not that the scribbler exists. The danger would be letting the scribbler become the messenger. But the existence of the scribbler may actually be evidence of containment, because the rawest version of the thought was kept private rather than sent. Amaza 4. What each version wants. The orange writer wants compliance, clarity, and enforceable repair conditions. The scribbler wants reality contact. That is a very important distinction. The orange writer says, here are the steps. The scribbler says, do you even understand what is true? The orange writer can proceed even if the other person is emotionally unavailable, because it can operate through boundaries and deadlines. The scribbler cannot be satisfied by compliance alone. It wants the person on the other side to actually see the inversion, the unfairness, the misrepresentation, the absurdity, the pain, and the stakes. That is why the scribbler is more volatile. It is not merely enforcing a boundary, it is still emotionally reaching for recognition. Sh5. Should he ever see this? Almost certainly not as is. These pages could be useful as source material for you. They could also be useful as proof to yourself that the outward-facing version is heavily filtered, but shown directly, the scribbles would probably overwhelm their own evidentiary value. The best use is translation, not disclosure. The usable message is not, open quote, look how violently I reacted to your words. Close quote, the usable message is closer to. Open quote, I went through your response carefully, line by line. My private notes were much angrier than anything I intend to send you, because I am trying hard to separate my immediate reaction from the response that has the best chance of helping us. But the depth of that reaction matters. Many of your statements landed not merely as hurtful, but as reversals of reality that I believe must be addressed directly. Close quote. That preserves the truth of the scribbler without handing over the scribbler as a weapon against yourself. Bottom line. The orange writer is controlled severity. The scribbler is live moral injury under analytical discipline. The orange writer is fit for contact. The scribbler is fit for diagnosis, drafting, self-protection, and extraction of truth claims. The most accurate version of you is not one or the other. It is the system in which the scribbler detects what matters and the orange writer decides what can safely be said. Yes, sir. The most generous, coherent reading is this. Your father is not primarily answering the facts. He is answering the courtroom you built around the facts. That does not mean your courtroom is illegitimate. But if I am trying to read him as respectfully and rightly as possible, his response becomes much more coherent if I treat it as a jurisdictional objection. He is refusing to accept that you, Kim, ChatGPT, legal process, written deadlines, and Sarah access conditions now form the authorized tribunal before which he must prove his moral fitness. His strongest holistic position. His implicit argument is something like, open quote, "You are presenting this as repair, but it feels to me like prosecution. You have already judged me, involved your wife as a united front, attempted legal action, restricted my access to Sarah, and now you are giving me a personality test under threat of further consequences. I do not experience that as an honest invitation to reconciliation. I experience it as a control structure. I am hurt, afraid, angry, and unwilling to let my own son become the authority who decides whether I am psychologically acceptable enough to remain family." Close quote. That is the most coherent center of his response. From there, many of his individual replies become more intelligible. 1. He is resisting your use of we. When he pushes back on your wife's involvement, the most charitable reading is not simply, he is attacking Kim. It is that he experiences the Orange text's repeated household unity framing as triangulation. The Orange writer says in substance, Kim and I have evaluated this together, and our household is now imposing terms. Your father's best response is, no, you are my son, own your words. Do not turn this into a two-person institutional authority over me. That is not necessarily fair to Kim's actual role, especially given what you have explained. But perceptively he may be reacting to the way we converts a father-son rupture into a proceeding before a marital board of review. Amasa 2. He is treating the personality survey as a dignity threat. This is probably one of the most important pieces. You intended the survey as a diagnostic repair instrument, a way to test mutual understanding, expose projection, and create structured dialogue. But his most charitable perception is, my son is making me sit for an emotional competency exam, possibly designed with AI, and my access to family depends on whether I pass. That is a humanly understandable humiliation trigger. Even if the survey is strategically brilliant from your side, it is not hard to see how a father could experience it as infantilizing or dehumanizing. In his best reading, refusing the survey is not avoidance. It is a defense of basic dignity. He is saying, you do not get to reduce me to a data object and then decide whether I am fit to love my granddaughter. Number 3. He is objecting to legal pressure as incompatible with emotional repair. His repeated references to restraining orders, courts, legal positioning, and jail are imprecise but perceptively coherent. The charitable reading is not that he understands the law perfectly. It is that he experiences the legal escalation as a family rupture being moved into coercive territory. So when the Orange text says legal positioning, he hears something like, open quote, you tried to use the courts against me, and now you are accusing me of being the one hiding behind legal positioning. Close quote. That is why he keeps circling back to legal process. He is not only arguing facts, he is saying you cannot threaten my legal standing, my access to Sarah, and my identity as a father, grandfather, and then ask me to treat this as a normal family repair exercise. That is a perceptively real objection, even if it leaves out your reasons for using legal mechanisms. 4. He is trying to reverse the frame from your avoidance to your conduct. The Orange language frames his delay, fear, and distrust as evidence of avoidance or bad faith. His response says, in effect, no, my distrust is not the problem. My distrust is a response to what you have done. That is the core reversal. He is not accepting your frame that the main question is whether he can acknowledge reality. He is asserting that you are also part of the reality to be acknowledged. His strongest version is, you are demanding my self-reflection while refusing to absorb how frightening, hurtful, and extreme your own conduct has looked from my side. This is probably his most defensible move. Even if many of his factual conclusions are wrong, the structural demand is not crazy. If one person demands total self-reflection from another, the other person can rightly ask whether the demand maker is also self-reflecting. Number 5. His references to Sarah are best read as attachment panic. When he talks about Sarah, the most charitable reading is not entitlement to access. It is grandparent attachment panic. From his perspective, he may feel that the sweetest and most innocent relationship in the family is being converted into leverage. He sees himself as someone who loves Sarah, would never hurt her, and has now been placed in the category of danger. That would feel catastrophic if sincerely believed. So his emotional position becomes, open quote, "You are not merely angry at me. You are teaching my granddaughter that I am unsafe, and I have no normal way to defend myself." Close quote. That does not decide whether your boundary was justified, but it helps explain why he responds with such alarm. He may be experiencing Sarah access restriction not as consequence, but as moral erasure. Number 6. His plain language claim is a rejection of your formal register. The Orange writer uses polished, formal, quasi-legal structure. Your father's best response is, "This is not plain family communication. This is lawyerly, procedural, and self-protective." So when he insists that his own response is plain, he is contrasting two moral aesthetics. Your Orange text says clarity through structure. His response says truth through plainness. From his side, your structure may look like a mechanism for control. From your side, his plainness may look like scattershot evasion. But in his best version, he is saying, "Stop managing me through documents. Talk to me as your father." Number 7. His strongest moral complaint is that you pre-selected the verdict grows. This is the heart of his empty threats delay tactic, already played your hand reactions. He is reading the Orange text as if the outcome is already determined. In that reading, the survey, deadlines, and conditions are not genuine paths to repair. They are hoops set up after conviction. His implicit objection, open quote, "You say this process is about finding out who I am, but your language already tells me who you think I am. You are not asking, you are sentencing." Close quote. Again, this is not necessarily fair to your actual intent, but it is one of the most perceptively plausible interpretations of how your Orange language could land on him. Number 8. His response is most respectful when understood as, "I refuse this process, not you." The handwritten follow-up note matters here, even though you asked me to center the white page response. The best reading of the typed responses is made stronger by the later handwritten note. He is not necessarily saying, "I reject you forever." He is saying, "I reject this mode of engagement." So his most respectful underlying position is, open quote, "I still love you. I still want a relationship. But I will not participate in a repair process that begins by treating me as dangerous, dishonest, psychologically deficient, and subject to your deadlines." Close quote. That is probably the best possible version of him in this document. Where the charitable reading cannot honestly go. The generous interpretation cannot require pretending that all his factual claims are accurate. It also cannot turn his fear into proof. A person may sincerely feel legally threatened, misrepresented, or deprived of family access without therefore being correct about every underlying event. The best charitable reading is not, "Dad is right about the whole situation." It is, open quote, "Dad is responding to the Orange language as a man who believes the relationship has been converted into a coercive proceeding, and his central act is to reject the authority of that proceeding while trying, however angrily, to preserve his dignity as father and grandfather." Close quote. That is a much stronger and more respectful reading than "he is merely defensive," the most useful distilled version. If I had to compress his best response into one clean paragraph, it would be this. Open quote, "I hear your pain, but I do not accept the process you have built around it. You are speaking to me as though I am a defendant, not your father. You have involved your wife as a united authority, used legal mechanisms, restricted my relationship with Sarah, and now demand that I complete a personality survey under threat of further consequences. I do not experience that as repair. I experience it as control. I am willing to have an honest relationship with you, but not one where I must first submit to your framework, your deadlines, your test, or your judgment of my psychological fitness." Close quote. That is the most rightful version I can give him without relying on factual falsehood or bad faith rationalization. Yes, sir. The stricter standard matters here because understandable, emotionally coherent, strategically useful, and good faith are not the same category. For this answer, I would define broadly acceptable good faith as language behavior that meets most of these tests. It distinguishes fact from inference, avoids knowingly exaggerated motive claims, gives the other person a real path to correct the issue, does not use humiliation as leverage, does not diagnose as a weapon, and remains proportionate to the actual conduct being addressed. Under that stricter standard, both writers have real good faith material, but neither gets a blank check. I, the Orange Writer. The Orange Writer is responding to the father's first non-response. Delay, postponement, non-completion, or refusal to comply with the requested process. Read most favorably, the Orange Writer is not primarily trying to punish. He is trying to prevent the process from dissolving into ambiguity. His best good faith center is, open quote, "You were asked to participate in a concrete repair process. You did not do so directly. I am not willing to treat delay, procedural confusion, fear, or vague future openness as equivalent to engagement. I need direct action, because without direct action there is no stable basis for repair." Close quote. That is broadly defensible. The Orange Writer is at his best when he is doing four things: clarifying the purpose of the survey, rejecting indefinite postponement, requiring direct written communication, and protecting his household from being pulled into an emotionally chaotic process with no measurable commitments. What is clearly good faith in the Orange response? The Orange Writer's strongest good faith move is insisting that delay itself communicates something. That is fair. When a conflict has become severe, "I will do it later" is not neutral. It may be caution, it may be fear, it may be confusion, it may be avoidance, but it is not nothing. The Orange Writer is allowed to say, "I cannot build trust on indefinite postponement." He is also on good faith ground when he says the personality survey was not meant to magically solve anything. That is a defensible clarification. The Orange Writer is saying, the task is not the cure. The task is an observable test of willingness, honesty, and engagement. That is severe, but not inherently bad faith. He is also broadly defensible in requiring text message communication only. A person may set a written-only boundary when live conversation has become unsafe, distorted, or too emotionally volatile. That is not inherently controlling. It becomes controlling only if the written-only rule is used to deny any meaningful path forward. Here, the Orange Writer does provide a path: complete the survey and send photos. The demand for photos of the completed survey by a date is also defensible if framed as a condition of continued engagement, not as a command over the father's personhood. "You must do this to continue this process" is stricter but defensible. "You must do this because I have authority over you" would not be. Where the Orange Writer starts approaching the edge. The Orange Writer gets weaker when he converts interpretation into certainty. For example, saying the delay reads to us as attempted non-compliance disguised as cooperation is potentially defensible if carefully framed as perception. But if it is presented as settled fact, a sensible reader may object. A good faith version would preserve the possibility that the father's delay came from fear, confusion, shame, pride, or emotional flooding, not only manipulative non-compliance. The Orange Writer's phrase, hiding behind delay, fear, control, or legal positioning, is also morally risky. It may be perceptively true from his vantage point, but it imputes motive. A stricter good faith version would say, "Your delay has the practical effect of preventing direct engagement." That is more defensible because it addresses effect without pretending to have full access to motive. The line about "your wife was not a part of the April 15th issue" may be good faith factual correction. But "do not use your wife as a shield" is not safely good faith under the strict standard. It accuses the father of tactical cowardice. That may be emotionally plausible, but a sensible reader could say, "You are not merely correcting him, you are assigning a dishonorable motive." The correction is defensible. The shield framing is much less so. Where the Orange Writer is not sufficiently defensible under a strict good faith standard, the Orange Writer's weakest category is psychological labeling. Phrases like apparent paranoia are not broadly acceptable good faith language unless the writer is being extremely careful, specific, and non-punitive. Here, it is being used in a boundary enforcement context. That makes it vulnerable. A sensible reader could easily hear it as, "Your fear is not just wrong, it is psychologically defective. That is not a stable repair posture." The therapy/counseling requirement is also a mixed case. It can be good faith if framed as, "Before we attempt reconciliation, I need evidence that you are working with a neutral professional because the pattern has become too damaging for us to handle alone." That is legitimate, but it becomes morally dubious if it reads as, "I have diagnosed you, and now you must obtain treatment before I will recognize you as safe or rational." The Orange writer sometimes drifts toward that second version. Not completely, but enough that a sensible reader could object. The strongest strict critique of the Orange writer is this. He sometimes asks for self-reflection, while using language that gives the father little room to be self-reflective in any way other than submission to the Orange writer's frame. That is not fatal to the whole letter, but it is a real good faith vulnerability. Strict verdict on the Orange writer. The Orange writer is substantially good faith in purpose, but uneven in execution. His defensible core is boundaries, directness, no indefinite delay, written communication, concrete participation, protection of child-household stability. His insufficiently defensible edge is motive certainty, psychological labeling, treating non-compliance as morally proven rather than behaviorally concerning, and using some language that can sound less like invitation to repair and more like sentencing. A broadly acceptable version of the Orange writer would keep the structure and remove some of the verdict language. 2. The scribbled writer. The scribbled writer is responding not to the father's delay, but to the father's actual answers and written claims. This matters. The scribbled writer is not reacting to silence. He is reacting to perceived falsehood, reversal, accusation, and moral distortion. That gives the scribbled writer a stronger basis for anger than if he were merely speculating from absence. But under the stricter standard, the scribbled writer has to be divided sharply into two categories: private processing and communicative good faith. As private processing, much of it is understandable and sometimes useful. As communication to the father, much of it would fail the good faith standard. What is genuinely good faith in the scribbled response? The scribbled writer's strongest good faith feature is that he is still trying to sort truth from falsity. The color system matters. He is not marking everything the same. He is trying to distinguish wrong and harmful, factually accurate but meaning misconstrued, and non-assertive text. That is a serious effort at classification. It shows that even in anger, he has not abandoned the concept that some statements may be more true, less true, partly true, or merely non-responsive. That is good faith cognition. His most defensible notes are the ones that ask for evidence or identify concrete factual disputes. "Show me the order. We have transcripts. This did not happen. What exactly do you think I did? Who told you that? What could this mean? Prove me wrong." Those are broadly acceptable in substance. They are demands for specificity. They do not require the father to submit to a moral label. They require him to substantiate claims. The scribbled writer is also good faith when he notices contradictions between the father's claims and external facts, such as whether an order existed, whether something happened in court, whether someone actually said or did a thing, or whether a statement is being treated as factual when it appears to be assumption. That is one of the most legitimate functions of private annotation, catching places where emotional narrative has detached from checkable reality. Where the scribbled writer is emotionally valid but not good faith communication. The profanity, insults, and contempt are emotionally understandable. They are not good faith communicative language. "Are you fucking insane?" may accurately convey the scribbled writer's disbelief. It does not invite correction, repair, or mutual recognition. A sensible reader would not have to treat that as good faith engagement. "Fuck you," "asshole," "fucking insane," and similar eruptions are not defensible as broadly acceptable communication. They may be tolerable as private pressure release, but only because they were not intended for the father to see. The private nature is doing nearly all the moral work there. The same is true of diagnostic or quasi-diagnostic language. Calling something psychopath or insane may be rhetorically satisfying, But under a strict good faith standard, it is not acceptable unless used with extraordinary care, and this is not that. It is a heat word, not a disciplined claim. The scribbled writer also sometimes overuses totalizing language. All of this is false. May be true in a narrow factual sense in some places, but as a general response it risks becoming too broad. A strict good faith version would separate. This part is factually false. This part is a distorted interpretation. This part is emotionally understandable but incomplete. And this part is an accusation without evidence. The scribbled writer has the raw material for that distinction, but the private anger sometimes outruns the classification system. Where the scribbled writer is not sufficiently defensible, even as analysis. Some scribbled reactions appear to treat the father's perception as so absurd that it barely deserves interpretation. That is understandable, but not fully good faith if the assignment is to analyze another person's claims. For example, what the fuck could that mean? Can be a legitimate analytic question. But if the implied answer is nothing, because only an idiot or liar would say this, that is not strict good faith. A good faith analyst has to ask, what experience, fear, misunderstanding, second-hand report, shame reaction, or distorted inference might have produced this claim? The scribbled writer occasionally does that, but he also sometimes jumps straight to contempt. Under the strict standard, contempt is not analysis. Another weak area is rhetorical certainty around motive. The scribbled writer is excellent at identifying likely factual wrongness. He is less defensible when moving from "this is false" to "you are knowingly doing X." A person can say a false thing sincerely. A person can be badly wrong without lying. The scribbled writer's better self seems to know that, but the scribbled surface language sometimes collapses wrongness, cowardice, bad faith, and stupidity into one package. That is not broadly acceptable good faith interpretation. The scribbled writer's best strict good faith center. If stripped of contempt, the scribbled writer's best argument is powerful. Open quote. Your answers contain many claims that appear factually false, unsupported, exaggerated, or based on second-hand assumptions. I am not merely offended by them. I need to know what factual basis you think supports them. If you believe I threatened you, abused my mother, used Kim as a shield, tried to jail you, or manipulated legal processes, then identify the specific event, words, document, witness, or action. Otherwise, these accusations cannot be treated as truth. They can only be treated as your perception, fear, or inherited narrative. Close quote. That is very strong. That is broadly defensible. That is the scribbled writer translated into good faith. Strict verdict on the scribbled writer. The scribbled writer is good faith as private reality defense, but not good faith as direct communication. His defensible core is fact-checking, contradiction detection, evidence demands, classification, refusal to let accusation become truth by repetition, and preservation of the distinction between actual events and perceived meaning. His insufficiently defensible edge is contempt, profanity, diagnostic insults, totalizing dismissals, an occasional collapse of false into malicious without enough proof. The most important distinction is this. The scribbled writer is not morally disqualified by existing privately. Private rage notes can be part of a healthy containment process, but the scribbled writer cannot be allowed to present himself as the actual messenger. He has to be translated first. Comparative bottom line. The orange writer is closer to broadly acceptable outward good faith, but he risks over-controlling the frame. The scribbled writer is closer to raw factual confrontation, but he risks contempt and communicative destructiveness. The orange writer's failure mode is procedural domination. The scribbled writer's failure mode is contemptuous totalization. The best morally defensible version of the whole system is, open quote, the scribbled writer identifies the factual and moral pressure points. The orange writer decides which of those points can be stated in a way that gives the father a real chance to answer, correct, explain, or take responsibility without first being humiliated. Close quote. That is the clean line. The scribbler can find the truth pressure. The orange writer has to make it humanly answerable. Correct. That attribution was wrong. The "your wife was not" line belongs to the father writer, not the orange writer. For this aside, I would rank them this way on personality consistency only, with factual merit and moral legitimacy bracketed out. Number 1, orange writer, most personality consistent. The orange writer has the clearest single operating personality. Across the orange text, the same person keeps showing up: controlled, formal, prosecutorial, boundary-setting, procedure-oriented, and morally certain. The emotional posture is severe but channeled. The writer does not meaningfully switch modes. He stays inside one stable frame. Open quote, "This is serious. There's consequences. I am setting terms. I am not accepting delay, evasion, or procedural confusion as good faith repair." Close quote, even when the orange writer becomes harsher, the harshness is stylistically continuous with the opening posture. It is not a new personality intruding. It is the same controlled authority increasing pressure. The orange writer's consistency is almost architectural. He builds a structure and remains inside it. The emotional character is disciplined indignation converted into enforceable process. That does not mean he is the most right, kind, or persuasive. It means that, as a personality presentation, he is the most internally stable. Number 2, father writer, second most personality consistent hem. The father writer is also highly consistent, but less cleanly than the orange writer. His recurring personality center is wounded, defensive, dignity protective, suspicious of being judged, resistant to imposed process, and deeply invested in his identity as father-grandfather. Nearly everything he writes can be read as coming from that one posture. Open quote, "You are treating me like a defendant, not your father. I am hurt, I feel accused, I do not accept your authority over me, and I believe your process is the problem." Close quote. That is a consistent character. Where he becomes less consistent than the orange writer is that he shifts among several sub-roles: hurt father, accused victim, moral scold, legal process objector, plain-spoken truth-teller, grandfather deprived of access, and person demanding that others self-reflect. Those roles are compatible, but they are not as tightly unified in presentation as the orange writer's role. The father writer's personality consistency is emotional rather than structural. He is not building one clean procedural machine. He is orbiting the same injury from several angles. So his consistency is real but more reactive and less disciplined. Number 3, scribbled writer, least personality consistent. The scribbled writer is still recognizable as one person, but he is the most internally variable presentation. His stable core is obvious: furious, intelligent, incredulous, fact-checking, contemptuous of perceived distortion, and desperate to pin down reality. The same voice keeps returning. Open quote, "What exactly are you saying? Prove it. This is false. This is insane. Where is the evidence?" Close quote. So I would not call him incoherent. There is a strong central personality, high-voltage reality defense. But compared to the other two, the scribbled writer shifts modes much more sharply. He moves between forensic annotation, profanity, sarcasm, direct challenge, ridicule, emotional appeal, meta-analysis, classification, and almost theatrical emphasis. The giant words, arrows, circles, color code legend, evidentiary notes, and explosions of disbelief all belong to the same mind, but not to the same controlled presentation. Assuming this was delivered as is, a sensible reader would probably experience the scribbled writer as the least personality consistent, because the register keeps changing moment by moment. He is consistent in underlying drive, but inconsistent in communicative form. Final ranking 1. Orange writer, most consistent, controlled procedural moral authority. 2. Father writer, strongly consistent, wounded defensive father-grandfather resisting judgment. 3. Scribbled writer, least consistent, recognizable but highly volatile reality defense, shifting rapidly among analysis, anger, sarcasm, and direct challenge. The cleanest distinction is this, sir. The orange writer has one face. The father writer has one wound. The scribbled writer has one engine, but many exhaust pipes. Yes, sir. I would use a generous but still defensible standard here. A writer is acting in good faith if their language can reasonably be read as an attempt to protect truth, dignity, safety, relationship, or fair process, without needing to assume they knowingly lied, intentionally manipulated, or used a tactic they themselves understood was illegitimate. This allows anger, defensiveness, suspicion, and poor phrasing. It does not allow deliberate factual invention, knowingly bad logic, or pure coercion disguised as dialogue. Under that standard, the ranking is 1. Orange writer, 8.2. Scribbled writer, 6.810. 3. Father writer, 6.110. The gaps are meaningful but not catastrophic under this generous frame. Number 1. Orange writer, strongest good faith argumentation. The orange writer's strongest good faith feature is that he is trying to convert emotional conflict into a concrete process. He states a purpose, identifies the problem as he understands it, sets expectations, defines next steps, gives a deadline, and attempts to make future ambiguity harder. That is a real good faith strength. A person who wants only domination usually does not bother building a record of terms, conditions, reasons, and procedural expectations. The orange writer's argument is severe, but it is legible. His core good faith position is, open quote, "We cannot repair this through vague emotional gestures, delay, or unstructured conversation. I need you to take a concrete step that demonstrates direct engagement with reality as I understand it." Close quote. That is a defensible repair theory, even if a respondent could object to its pressure. The orange writer also gives the father a knowable path. Complete the survey, return it by text, stop postponing, communicate in writing. That matters. The demand is not infinite or impossible. It may be emotionally difficult, but it is observable. The shortest fair weakness list is this. The orange writer sometimes overstates inference as established fact. He tends to move quickly from "your conduct has this effect" to "your conduct means this motive." That weakens the good faith posture because it narrows the father's ability to answer without first accepting the orange writer's diagnosis of him. The orange writer sometimes makes repair feel like adjudication. The structure is clear, but it can read less like "please meet me here" and more like "you are now subject to these findings and orders." That does not destroy the good faith, but it creates a real vulnerability. Still, the orange writer is the strongest because the argument has internal discipline, stated standards, and a plausible path forward. Number 2. Scribbled writer. Second strongest good faith argumentation NAFA. The scribbled writer is much rougher, but his good faith core is stronger than the surface tone makes it look. His central function is reality protection. He is not merely reacting, he is sorting. The color categories, arrows, questions, corrections, and evidence demands show that he is trying to distinguish falsehood, misconstrual, non-assertive language, and factual accuracy. That is a major good faith marker. His best argument is, open quote, "These claims cannot simply be allowed to stand as truth. If you believe these things, identify the specific basis. If you cannot, then we need to distinguish your fear, interpretation, or second-hand impression from actual fact." Close quote. That is not only good faith, it is one of the most legitimate arguments in the whole document. The scribbled writer also asks many of the right questions. What did you mean? Where is the order? Who said that? What exactly happened? What evidence supports this? Those are not bad faith questions. Those are accountability questions. The shortest fair weakness list is this. The scribbled writer's contempt makes the good faith substance harder to receive. Profanity, ridicule, and what the fuck disbelief do not erase the underlying truth-seeking, but they do make the communication much less broadly defensible if delivered as is. The scribbled writer sometimes compresses false, absurd, and bad faith too tightly together. Some claims may be false because the father misunderstood, absorbed second-hand distortion, or filled gaps with fear. The scribbled writer is strongest when demanding evidence. He is weakest when contempt substitutes for that demand. I rank him above the father writer because even at high heat, the scribbled writer is more consistently trying to test claims against evidence. His tone is much worse. His epistemic posture is better. Number 3. Father writer, weakest, but still meaningfully defensible under the generous standard base. The father writer's good faith center is not trivial. He appears to be defending dignity, resisting what he perceives as a coercive process, and trying to reject a framework in which he feels pre-condemned. His best argument is, open quote, "You are presenting this as repair, but from my side it feels like prosecution. I do not experience your survey, deadlines, legal framing, and SARA access consequences as an open dialogue. I experience them as a process where I have already been judged and must now submit." That is a legitimate perceptive truth. It may be incomplete, but it is not inherently dishonest. His most defensible move is refusing to let the Orange writer's structure become the only valid frame. In any conflict, the person being evaluated is allowed to say, "I do not accept your evaluation process as neutral." That can be avoidance, but it can also be self-protection. Under this generous standard, we should allow the possibility that he sincerely experiences the process as humiliating or threatening. The shortest fair weakness list is this. The father writer treats perception too much like established fact. His argument relies heavily on claims about motives, legal threat, manipulation, hatred, fear, and misuse of SARA without consistently grounding those claims in concrete evidence. The father writer answers the pressure of the Orange process more than he answers the substance. That is understandable if he believes the process itself is illegitimate, but it weakens his good faith score because it leaves many direct issues unaddressed. That is why he ranks third. Not because his emotional posture is fake, but because his argument does less careful truth testing than the other two. He has a real grievance about the process, but he uses that grievance to bypass too much of the factual burden. Final ranking, rank writer score, good faith center, main weakness. 1. Orange writer, 8.210. Builds a concrete repair accountability process, overstates some inferences, and can sound adjudicative. 2. Scribbled writer, 6.810. Demands factual grounding and resists distortion. Contempt and profanity damage communicative good faith. 3. Father writer, 6.110. Defends dignity against a process he experiences as coercive, treats perception as fact and avoids too much substance. The cleanest summary, the Orange writer has the best procedural good faith. The Scribbled writer has the best evidentiary good faith. The father writer has the best dignity defense good faith. But if all three are judged by the same overall standard, the Orange writer is strongest because he provides the clearest path forward. The Scribbled writer is second because his factual accountability is real despite the contempt. And the father writer is third because his sincerity is plausible, but his argument leans most heavily on unproven perception. Yes, sir. To maximize contrast without becoming unfair, I would use a strict communicative good faith standard. Open quote. A delivered argument is good faith to the extent that it is answerable, proportionate, fact-disciplined, dignity-preserving, and gives the other party a real path to respond without first submitting to humiliation or total moral defeat. Close quote. That standard punishes totalized moral righteousness pretty harshly when it appears as accusation, contempt, or motive certainty. It also heavily rewards structure, specificity, and controlled language. Under that contrast-maximizing standard, rank writer, good faith argumentation score, third-party persuasion difficulty, 1 orange writer 8.0 the 10, moderate, 2 father writer 4.210 high, 3 scribbled writer 1.8 per 10 very high. Number 1. Orange writer, strongest by a wide margin. The orange writer's moral totalization is real. He is not writing from neutral curiosity. He has already largely concluded that delay, non-response, and evasive positioning are morally meaningful, but his advantage is that his totalized morality is converted into procedure. That matters enormously. The orange writer says, in substance, open quote, here is the problem. Here is why the non-response matters. Here is what the requested action is. Here is the deadline. Here is the consequence of continued non-participation. Close quote. That is not automatically correct, but it is highly answerable. A respondent can comply, refuse, object, ask for clarification, or counter-propose. The orange writer may be severe, but he gives the other person a defined surface to push against. His strongest good faith features. He distinguishes the survey from magical resolution. He treats participation as evidence, not as instant reconciliation. He gives a concrete next step. He keeps the language mostly outward-facing. He does not rely primarily on insult, ridicule, or emotional spillage. He creates a record that an impartial reader can follow. His weakness is that he sometimes treats inference as verdict. The orange writer can sound as if he is saying, your behavior means what I say it means. That is the main good faith vulnerability. But compared with the other two, his argument remains much more disciplined. The orange writer's totalized morality is the easiest to defend because it looks like accountability rather than mere anger. An impartial third party might still worry that the process is controlling, especially because a personality survey plus deadlines plus family access consequences can look heavy-handed. But the orange writer can explain himself relatively cleanly. Open quote, I set a structured boundary because unstructured emotional conversation had become unsafe, unproductive, or easily distorted. Close quote. That argument is not guaranteed to win, but it is coherent. Number 2. Father writer, morally intelligible, argumentatively weak. The father writer also has a coherent totalized morality. His position is essentially, open quote, I am being prosecuted by my son under the label of repair. I do not accept the legitimacy of this process, and I will not submit to a framework that treats me as dangerous, dishonest, or psychologically deficient before I have even been heard. Close quote. That is a real argument. It is not inherently bad faith. His best good faith feature is that he objects to the jurisdiction of the orange writer's process. He is not merely dodging individual claims, he is saying the entire structure is wrong. A person is allowed to say, I do not accept your tribunal. That gives him a defensible center. But under a strict standard, his execution is much weaker than the orange writer's. He appears to answer the feeling of being accused more than the actual content of the accusations. He repeatedly converts his perceptions into implied facts, that he is being manipulated, threatened, hated, excluded unfairly, or used as a target of legal aggression. Some of those may be perceptively sincere, but sincerity is not enough for strong good faith argumentation. His shortest weakness list, he does not carry enough factual burden. He treats his emotional perception as evidence. He resists the process more than he answers the substance. He frames himself as wronged without giving the other side an equally serious path to be right. That last one is the key contrast with orange. The orange writer gives a path, however severe. The father writer mostly rejects the path and substitutes grievance. For a third party, the father writer's best route is to argue, open quote, this process is coercive and humiliating. Even if my son has grievances, he is not entitled to make me pass a test to remain family. Close quote, That could persuade some people. It is probably his strongest outside-facing argument, but proving that his totalized morality is the most correct one is much harder. He would need to show not merely that the Orange process felt bad, but that his refusal and accusations were proportionate, grounded, and responsive. That is a much steeper climb. Number 3, scribbled writer, strongest factual engine, weakest delivered good faith. The scribbled writer's totalized morality is also coherent. Open quote, false accusations, distortions, and reversals of reality cannot be allowed to stand. Every unsupported claim must be pinned down, exposed, and forced back into factual accountability. Close quote. That core is powerful. In translated form, it may even be the most epically valuable position in the whole exchange. But the prompt says to assume the scribbled responses were delivered as is. Under that assumption, the scribbled writer is overwhelmingly the weakest good faith arguer. The issue is not that he is angry. The issue is that the delivered form contains too much contempt, profanity, ridicule, visual aggression, and total dismissal. Even when the underlying point is valid, the communicative form often says, open quote, "You are so wrong that you barely deserve a dignified answer." Close quote. That is extremely hard to defend as good faith argumentation. The assumption that it caused no further escalation helps only slightly. It means the scribbled response may not have been practically destructive. But good faith is not measured only by whether a fire started afterward. It is measured by whether the communication itself gave the other person a fair, dignified, answerable path. As delivered, the scribbled writer mostly does not. His shortest weakness list, he uses contempt as a carrier for truth. He collapses factual challenge into personal condemnation. He gives the respondent very little dignified way to answer. He makes an impartial reader work too hard to separate valid evidence demands from emotional attack. The scribbled writer's third-party problem is severe. A third party might eventually identify many valid factual objections inside the scribbles, but the scribbled writer would first have to survive the reader's immediate reaction to the delivery. His best argument would be, open quote, "The intensity of my response reflects the severity of the falsehoods, and the notes repeatedly demand evidence rather than merely venting." Close quote. That is not nothing, but it is still hard. Most impartial readers will not reward raw contempt just because some factual points underneath it are strong. Maximum contrast final ranking 1. Orange writer, best good faith arguer. He may be severe and morally totalized, but he is structured, answerable, and outward-facing. 2. Father writer, partially defensible but substantively evasive. He has a real dignity objection, but he relies too heavily on perception and does not meet enough factual burden. 3. Scribbled writer, weakest as delivered. He has the strongest raw reality defense engine, but as communication he is too contemptuous to score well under a strict good faith standard. The cleanest contrast, open quote, the orange writer says, "Here is the process." The father writer says, "I reject your process." The scribbled writer says, "Your answer is bullshit." Close quote. The first is easiest to defend. The second is defensible but incomplete. The third may contain truth, but as delivered, it is the hardest to defend as good faith argumentation. Yes, sir. Very likely. Not because the surface style is similar. It is not. The orange writer and scribbled writer look very different at the level of tone, polish, profanity, pacing, and audience awareness. They look like the same human because the underlying moral cognitive machinery is strikingly continuous. My estimate, question, likelihood, same underlying person, same authorial mind, 90 to 96%. Same person with no drafting assistance at all on the orange text, 70 to 85%. Different people in the same household coalition, possible, but much less likely. The biggest caveat is that the orange text is typed, formal, and could have been revised or AI-assisted, while the scribbles are immediate handwritten annotations. That weakens same literal writer of every word as a forensic claim. But it does not much weaken the same underlying speaker personality claim. The strongest evidence, same moral operating system. The orange writer and the scribbled writer both organize the conflict around the same central axis. Open quote, reality contact versus evasion distortion. Close quote. The orange writer says this formally: acknowledge reality, stop delaying, stop hiding behind legal positioning, complete the survey, communicate directly. The scribbled writer says it explosively: prove it, show me the order. What are you talking about? This did not happen. We have transcripts. What does that even mean? Those are different registers, but the same core demand. The orange writer builds a structured gate around truth. The scribbled writer guards the gate with a flamethrower. That is a very strong same-person signal. The second strongest evidence, shared precision habits. Both writers care intensely about categories. The orange writer categorizes behavior into cooperation, non-compliance, delay, correction, consequences, self-reflection, legal positioning, and good faith participation. The scribbled writer literally color codes the page into categories like wrong, harmful, factually accurate but meaning misconstrued, and non-assertive text. That is not just shared anger, that is shared cognitive architecture, an impulse to classify, sort, distinguish, rank, and preserve conceptual boundaries, even while emotionally activated. A different person could share the facts. A different person would be less likely to share that exact classification instinct. The third strongest evidence. Private notes defend the public text's intent. The scribbled writer repeatedly reacts as someone who knows exactly what the orange writer meant, not merely someone reading it externally. He does not just say, the orange writer appears to mean X. He defends the orange language from the inside. This was not a threat. This was not the legal meaning being claimed. This is data. This is not what was asked. This is being misread. That strongly suggests the scribbled writer is not merely an ally commenting on someone else's letter. He is protecting his own intended meaning against what he experiences as misconstrual. A spouse or close collaborator could do some of that. But the immediacy and ownership of the corrections make same person much more likely. The fourth strongest evidence, same unusual blend of legal, moral, and emotional reasoning. Both writers blend three modes that do not usually coexist at this intensity. 1. Legal procedural thinking. Order, court, text record, legal route, consequences, documentation. 2. Moral absolutism. Wrong, harmful, evasion, self-reflection, responsibility, truth. 3. Emotional relational stakes. Wife, mother, father, Sarah, fear, pain, love, threat, repair. The orange writer has those three in disciplined sequence. The scribbled writer has those three colliding on the page at once, but the ingredients are the same. The strongest evidence against same writer. The surface register is dramatically different. The orange writer is formal, linear, controlled, and audience-conscious. The scribbled writer is profane, non-linear, sarcastic, visually aggressive, and emotionally saturated. If I were trying to argue they were different people, I would say, open quote, one writer appears to be a formal procedural communicator, the other appears to be a reactive emotional annotator. Close quote. But that argument is weak because register switching explains the difference better than separate authorship does. People often write very differently when composing a message for delivery versus marking up a private copy in real time. The stronger interpretation is not two personalities. It is, open quote, same person, different containment levels, close quote. Hash the spouse collaborator alternative. The most plausible different person theory is not random different writer. It would be, open quote. The orange writer and scribbled writer are closely aligned household members, probably spouses, with shared facts and shared moral conclusions. Close quote. That could explain some overlap. But it does not explain as well the scribbled writer's intense ownership of the orange text's intent, nor the continuity of the classification moral reality framework. The scribbler sounds less like someone defending another person's document and more like someone watching his own meaning be misread in real time. Final judgment. I would call the orange and scribbled writers very likely the same human mind expressed through two different output channels. The orange writer is the public-facing containment system. The scribbled writer is the private real-time contradiction detector. The difference between them is mostly not personality, it is filtration. So the clean conclusion is, open quote, the orange text and scribbled annotations are highly likely to come from the same person, or at minimum from the same person's direct authorship ownership system. The evidence is not primarily handwriting. It is the shared moral grammar, shared epistemic habits, shared procedural instincts, and the scribbled writer's intimate defense of the orange writer's intended meaning. Close quote. Yes, sir. Under the new frame, the key change is that the orange and scribbled writers no longer compete with each other. They become a single two-layer writer. Open quote, private maximal moral anger plus public procedural containment. Close quote. That is a much stronger good faith profile than treating the scribbled writer as an independent delivered communicator. The scribbles become less, this person communicates contemptuously, and more. This person privately feels contempt disbelief, but usually translates it before delivery. That matters enormously. At core framing, both sides are totalized. The orange scribbled writer totalizes around. Open quote. Reality has been inverted. Falsehood, evasion, and role protection are being used to avoid accountability. I must force the facts back into view and protect my household. Close quote. The father writer totalizes around. Open quote. My son has converted family repair into prosecution. He has already judged me, placed himself above me, restricted my family role, and now demands submission to his process. Close quote. Those are both morally righteous positions. Neither side is speaking from mild preference. Each side believes the other side's framework is not merely mistaken, but morally illegitimate. The difference is that the combined orange scribbled writer has a much stronger translation system between moral outrage and outward action. Revised high contrast good faith ranking. Rank, writer, good faith argumentation score. Difficulty convincing impartial third party. 1. Orange scribbled writer, 8.410, moderate. 2. Father writer, 4.110, high to very high. This is a much wider gap than the earlier 3-writer version because the scribbled material no longer counts primarily as defective direct communication. It now counts as evidence of emotional intensity that was mostly contained. Number 1, orange scribbled writer, totalized but substantially more defensible. The combined writer's strongest argument is not that he is calm. He is clearly not calm underneath. His strongest argument is that he knows he is not calm underneath and still builds a structure that is more answerable than his raw reaction. That is the key good faith fact. The private writer says this is false, insane, offensive, and must be challenged. The public writer says, here is the process, here is the deadline, here is what cooperation would look like, here is why non-response matters. That is a major distinction. An impartial third party does not need to believe the orange scribbled writer has no anger. They need to believe the anger is being governed. And under your assumptions, it is. The combined writer's strongest good faith features are: he preserves factual accountability. He demands specificity rather than merely demanding submission. He distinguishes private reaction from delivered response. He creates a concrete path forward. He makes the dispute answerable by documents, dates, claims, and responses. He does not simply explode at the father writer despite having the capacity to do so. The scribbles actually help, if properly contextualized, not because they are admirable as communication, but because they show the difference between what the writer felt and what the writer chose to deliver. That supports a containment argument. Open quote, this is how angry and disbelieving I was. This is also what I did not send as my actual message. Close quote. That is powerful if the third party already accepts the premise that the scribbles were private processing or adversarially procured supporting material, not a direct communicative attack. The orange scribbled writer still has real vulnerabilities. The process can look coercive. The survey can look humiliating. The total moral certainty can look like the father was being offered only one acceptable outcome: admit the orange scribbled writer's framework or be labeled evasive. Those are not trivial weaknesses, but compared with the father writer, the combined writer has a clearer route to third-party persuasion because he can say, open quote, my anger was intense, but my outward process remained structured. My claims were tied to specific events, documents, deadlines, and evidence. I was not asking him to guess what repair required. I gave him a concrete way to respond. Close quote. That is a defensible moral posture. Number 2. Father writer. Totalized, but much harder to defend as superior agree. The father writer's best argument remains real. Open quote. This was not an equal repair process. It was a family prosecution. My son made himself judge. My daughter-in-law co-signed the judgment. My access to Sarah became conditional, and then I was handed a personality survey as though I had to prove my psychological worthiness to remain family. Close quote. That is the father writer's strongest possible third-party argument. It is not ridiculous. In fact, it is the one argument he absolutely should lead with if he wanted to persuade someone neutral. A sensible person could hear that and think, yes, that process sounds intense, possibly overbearing, maybe even humiliating. But his difficulty is that this argument does not automatically vindicate his full moral position. It only establishes that he may have experienced the process as coercive. To prove that his totalized morality was more correct, he would need to show more than discomfort. He would need to show that the orange-scribbled writer's factual concerns were materially wrong, that the boundaries were disproportionate, that his refusal was responsive rather than evasive, and that his own accusations were adequately grounded. That is much harder. His problem is that he appears to answer the jurisdiction of the process more than the substance of the claims. That can be legitimate up to a point. A person can say, I reject this tribunal. But if the underlying accusations involve child safety, family volatility, factual distortion, legal police events, and specific alleged misrepresentations, a third party will eventually ask, open quote, fine, you reject the tribunal, but what is your answer to the facts? Close quote. That is where the father writer's position weakens sharply. He can plausibly convince a third party that the orange-scribbled writer's process felt severe. He has a much harder time convincing them that his own totalized moral righteousness is the superior frame, because his response seems to rely heavily on perception, role injury, and counter-accusation, without the same level of evidentiary sorting. The decisive contrast, the orange-scribbled writer's totalized morality is, open quote, I am morally certain because the facts, contradictions, and documented pattern force this conclusion. Close quote, the father writer's totalized morality is, open quote, I am morally certain because the process being imposed on me feels wrongful, disrespectful, and threatening to my role. Close quote, both can be sincerely experienced. But the first is easier to argue before a neutral third party because it invites evidence. The second is harder because it depends heavily on whether the third party accepts the father writer's experience of humiliation as sufficient to override the factual inquiry. Relative persuasion difficulty. Orange-scribbled writer, moderate difficulty. His burden is to show that the severity was proportionate. He must prove. The underlying events were serious enough to justify written boundaries. The survey was a structured repair tool, not a dominance ritual. The private anger was contained rather than weaponized. The father was given a real opportunity to respond. The demands were concrete and not impossible. That is work, but it is doable. His largest risk is appearing too prosecutorial. His strongest protection is that he can demonstrate discipline. Private rage was not the same as public communication. Father writer, high to very high difficulty. His burden is heavier. He must prove. The orange-scribbled writer's process was illegitimate enough to justify rejecting it. His own factual accusations were grounded or at least reasonably inferred. His refusal was not avoidance. His injury as father-grandfather does not erase the need to answer specific concerns. His dignity defense was proportionate rather than self-protective deflection. That is much harder, especially if the third party is allowed to examine the full sequence rather than just react emotionally to the survey deadline structure. Final assessment. Under this combined writer frame, the orange-scribbled side becomes significantly stronger. Not because that side is less morally totalized. It is not. It is intensely totalized. It is stronger because its totalization is more fact-seeking, documentable, and behaviorally contained. The father writer's totalization is emotionally intelligible, but more dependent on his own felt experience of being wronged. That can earn sympathy. It does not as easily earn adjudicative confidence. So the clean final version is, open quote, the orange-scribbled writer has a difficult but coherent path to persuading an impartial third party. My moral certainty came from evidence, and my anger was contained into process. The father writer has a much harder path. My moral certainty came from rejecting the process as illegitimate, even though I did not answer much of the factual burden created by the conflict. Close quote. That is the decisive split. Yes, sir. Using the same frame, the key difference is that this chat log does not give Christopher the same containment advantage the orange scribbled analysis gave him. In the prior analysis, the strongest version was private fury existed, but the outward-facing communication was comparatively structured. In this chat log, Christopher's private maximal register appears much closer to the delivered message itself. That changes the ranking sharply. The log shows Colin initially saying he is not ready to talk, then Christopher sending a very long response anyway, including raging asshole, lunatic language, while also trying to affirm that Colin is no monster. Colin then frames Christopher as the problem, says others have a right to speak, and later says he wants a healthy relationship but needs more time to formulate his response. People are operating from totalized moral righteousness. Christopher's totalized morality. Open quote. Colin became abusive, threatening, and unsafe in front of my daughter. He is projecting responsibility onto me, and I must force the reality of what he did into view before he can turn concern, grievance, or family consensus into a weapon against me. Close quote. Colin's totalized morality. Open quote. Christopher is controlling, dominating, exhausting, and unable to perceive how he affects other people. My explosion was regrettable, but Christopher created the conditions that made it happen, and he is now recasting himself as the victim to avoid self-reflection. Close quote. Those are not mild positions. Each person thinks the other is not merely wrong, but fundamentally inverted. High contrast good faith ranking. Using a strict delivered communication standard, answerable, proportionate, fact-disciplined, dignity-preserving, and giving the other party a real path to respond. I would rank them this way. Rank person, good faith argumentation score. Difficulty convincing impartial third party their totalized morality is most correct. 1. Colin, 5.410, moderate to high. 2. Christopher, 3.210, high to very high from this log alone. That ranking is not. Colin is factually right. It is Colin's delivered posture is easier to frame as communicatively good faith in this specific log. Number 1. Colin, stronger delivered good faith, weaker factual burden. Colin's best good faith case is that he repeatedly frames himself as not ready, emotionally wounded, and trying to avoid saying more before he can say it productively. His 328 message is the cleanest example. He says there is much to discuss later, that he loves Christopher, wants a healthy relationship, and does not want to lash out in a way Christopher will interpret differently than intended. That is his strongest communicative good faith moment. His argument also He says Christopher does not listen, dominates conversations, makes others feel unheard, and then judges others by their reaction to him. As a third-party persuasion matter, the log itself gives Colin some help, because Christopher's responses are long, intense, highly interpretive, and difficult to answer without accepting Christopher's frame. Colin's stop working me reference is rhetorically effective because Christopher's language can plausibly feel like emotional management rather than direct listening. But Colin has a serious weakness, his Ming provocation-based self-exoneration. His line of argument can sound like, open quote, "You brought out the raging asshole in me." Close quote. That is a dangerous argument if the underlying conduct involved screaming, threats, or frightening a child. Even if Christopher was dominating or socially exhausting, that does not automatically justify Colin's escalation. Colin's burden is to separate two claims. 1. Christopher was behaving badly. 2. My response to Christopher was therefore morally understandable or proportionate. The first may be persuadable. The second is much harder. Colin's best third-party argument is, open quote, "I asked for time. I tried to communicate that Christopher was affecting everyone. I said I loved him and wanted a healthy relationship, and Christopher responded with overwhelming accusation, profanity, threat imagery, and refusal to hear my concern." Close quote, that can work. His difficulty is that he still has to answer the central safety allegation. If the impartial reader accepts that he screamed threats in front of Sarah, then Christopher made me do it becomes a very weak defense. Number 2. Christopher, stronger factual safety theory, much weaker delivered good faith. Christopher's strongest substantive case is serious. Colin allegedly threatened a small child's father with physical violence in front of that child. Christopher repeatedly frames the event as abuse, assault, and a family safety issue. If that factual core is proven or corroborated, it is much more morally powerful than Colin's complaint that Christopher was socially dominating or did not listen. Christopher also does something Colin does less of. He gives of what he believes happened. He describes pulling Colin away, remaining silent, others hearing the screaming, Colin continuing, and Sarah witnessing enough to make this a child safety matter. That factual specificity is a real persuasion asset. But as delivered communication, Christopher's case is badly damaged by his own "esken your throat" passage is the most obvious problem. Even if intended as a hypothetical warning about panic self-defense, as delivered it is extraordinarily hard to defend as good faith family communication. It turns a safety argument into something an impartial reader may experience as threat imagery. Likewise, "you do not fuck with my family," war, middle finger reactions, dumbass, go fuck yourself, and the May 1st die alone message all make Christopher's outward posture look punitive, contemptuous, and emotionally totalizing. This creates the central problem for Christopher before a neutral reader. Open quote. His factual accusation may his communication style gives Colin evidence for the claim that Christopher becomes overwhelming, morally prosecutorial, and difficult to reach. Close quote. That does not make Christopher wrong. It makes his burden harder. Christopher's best third-party argument is, open quote, "The intensity of my language came after a serious safety violation involving my child. I was not reacting to ordinary disagreement. I was responding to perceived abuse and threat." Close quote. That is a legitimate argument. But from this log alone, he still has to explain why his delivered response contains so much contempt, humiliation, and escalation after Colin had said he needed time. The decisive contrast, Colin's position is easier to present as communicatively restrained, but harder to present as substantively accountable. Christopher's position is easier to present as substantively serious, but harder to present as communicatively good faith. So the split is, open quote, Colin has the easier case that Christopher's communication is a problem. Christopher has the potentially stronger case that Colin's conduct was a safety problem. Close quote. Those are different kinds of persuasion. Relative third-party persuasion difficulty. Moderate to high difficulty. Colin can persuade a third party that Christopher is intense, controlling, and not listening. The text itself helps him. Christopher re-engages after Colin says he is not ready, sends extremely long messages, refuses to watch Colin's clip at first, and repeatedly escalates in all caps and insults. But Colin has a harder time proving his totalized morality is most correct, because his argument has to survive the question. Even if Christopher was obnoxious or dominating, why did that justify your explosion? If the event involved threatening behavior in front of Sarah, Colin's theory becomes much harder to defend. Christopher. High to very high difficulty from the log alone. Christopher can persuade a third party only if he successfully centers the child's safety and threat issue. That is his strongest ground. If the neutral reader believes Colin frightened Sarah or threatened physical violence, Christopher's moral position becomes much more defensible. But the log alone makes that hard, because Christopher's delivered language repeatedly confirms the very kind of intense, overwhelming, totalizing style Colin is complaining about. The May 1st final message is especially damaging because it moves beyond boundary setting into annihilating contempt. Final assessment. If judged only by good faith argumentation as delivered, Colin ranks higher. If judged by potential substantive moral seriousness, Christopher may have the stronger underlying case, but only if the factual safety allegations are substantiated outside the rhetoric of the chat. The cleanest final version. Open quote. Colin is easier to defend as the more good faith communicator in the text log. Christopher is easier to defend as the person raising the more serious underlying moral issue. But Christopher's delivered language makes it significantly harder for an impartial third party to accept his totalized moral righteousness without first separating his factual case from his rhetorical escalation. Close quote. Yes, sir. With those additional facts, the analysis changes materially. The earlier version judged the chat mostly as delivered text, with limited ability to know whose factual account was better. Under that constraint, Colin's communicative posture looked somewhat more defensible because he appeared to ask for time, claimed concern, and framed Christopher as overwhelming. But once Christopher's core factual claims are treated as materially corroborated by wife, mother, and daughter, and father only confirms the screaming while declining further detail, the central burden shifts. The question is no longer mainly, which writer sounds more measured in the log? It becomes, open quote, which writer's totalizing moral frame is more consistent with the confirmed reality beneath the log, and which writer is using communication style to clarify reality versus escape it? Close quote. Under that revised frame, the ranking flips. Rank, person. Revised good faith argumentation score. Difficulty persuading impartial third party. 1. Christopher, 7.1, moderate. 2. Colin, 3.910, high to very high. Number 1, Christopher, substantially stronger once the facts are anchored. Christopher's strongest position is now not just emotionally plausible, it is materially supported. Open quote, Colin screamed, behaved threateningly, and caused a child safety/family safety rupture. He then tried to recast the event as Christopher provoking or bringing out his rage, rather than directly owning the conduct. Close quote. That is a much stronger argument than it was when the facts were unanchored. The chat log already shows Christopher repeatedly centering the same core accusation. Colin was viciously insulting, profanely belligerent, threatened physical violence in front of Sarah, and then projected responsibility back onto Christopher. Christopher's 821 message is rhetorically extreme, but it is structured around a factual safety claim, not merely hurt feelings. Laltsayan changes the interpretation of Christopher's length. Before, the long messages could be read as evidence that Christopher dominates, overwhelms, and morally prosecutes. They still can be read that way at the surface level. But with the orange scribbled framework folded in, length becomes less straightforwardly damning. It may reflect formal processing mode, a composed, exhaustive attempt to pin down reality before the conflict can be distorted. That matters because the chat sharply changes after Colin responds at 8:25. Before that, Christopher is in formal message mode, lengthy, structured, moralized, but drafted. After that, the exchange becomes real-time and Christopher's register visibly drops into rage mode. Don't you dare! You are abusing us! War! Dumbass! Go fuck yourself! And repeated all-caps assault claims. That distinction here does not excuse every phrase, but it prevents the entire log from being flattened into Christopher talks like this. More accurately, open quote, Christopher's formal mode is severe, controlling, and exhaustive, but reality organizing. His rage mode is profane, reactive, and much less defensible, but it begins after Colin directly challenges the "we all" claim and starts reframing the concern narrative in real time. Close quote. The 824-825 transition is therefore a real evidentiary hinge. Christopher's second very long message ends with, I'm extremely worried about you. We all are. I love you, Colin. I always will. Colin immediately challenges who is we all, and the conversation becomes live combat. That makes Christopher's meltdown more UE switch, not simply the baseline communicative posture. Christopher's remaining weaknesses. The knife in your throat passage remains the largest liability. Even if understood as a hypothetical panic self-defense warning, it is still dangerous language in a family dispute and would be hard to defend to a neutral reader without careful context. The May worst message is also deeply damaging as delivered. Even of court denial and Sarah's drawing, you will never see me, pitiful failure, and die alone. Language reads as annihilating contempt rather than boundary setting. So Christopher does not become a perfect good faith communicator, but he becomes T-arguer because his rhetorical severity is attached to a corroborated safety reality. Number 2. Colin, communicatively smoother in moments, but much weaker after corroboration. Colin's best good faith material is still real. His 328 message says he needs time, loves Christopher, wants a healthy relationship, and does not want to lash out in a way Christopher will misinterpret. That remains his strongest delivered communication. but the added facts sharply weaken the broader moral frame he is trying to sell. Colin repeatedly Christopher caused or drew out his raging asshole mode. Christopher did not listen, dominated, made others unheard, and pushed everyone until they either gave in, left, or became raging assholes. That argument becomes much less defensible once the screaming and core-threatening conduct are corroborated. A third-party stopper was socially overwhelming. But Colin's problem is proportionality. He needs to prove not only that Christopher was difficult, but that Christopher's conduct meaningfully explains or morally mitigates Colin's screaming and threatening in front of a child. That is a very hard burden. Father's partial confirmation matters too. If even the more reluctant or non-committal witness confirms the screaming occurred but declines to answer further, that does not fully prove every detail. But it does remove Colin's ability to recast the event as merely Christopher's distorted emotional narrative. At minimum, the acoustic emotional core of Christopher's account is anchored. Colin's "we are worried for you" argument also becomes less persuasive after the added context. In isolation, it might sound like concern, but after a confirmed screaming incident, it can look like a familiar inversion. Open quote, "I scared hurt you, but the real issue is that everyone is worried about you." Close quote. That may be sincerely felt, but it is weak as good faith argumentation unless Colin first fully owns the conduct that created the safety rupture. The revised decisive contrast, Christopher's totalized morality, now rests on corroborated conduct. Open quote, "You screamed, threatened, frightened my family, and then tried to make my reaction the issue." Close quote. Colin's totalized morality rests on relational grievance and provocation theory. Open quote, "You dominate, you do not listen, and you made me become the raging asshole." Close quote. The first is easier to defend to an impartial third party because it is event-centered and witness-supported. The second is harder because it risks justifying escalation through subjective provocation. Third-party persuasion difficulty. Christopher, moderate difficulty. Christopher still has work to do. He must separate his valid safety case from his rhetorical excess. His best argument is, open quote, "My language became extreme, especially in real time after 825, but my core factual claims were materially confirmed by witnesses. The length and intensity of my formal messages reflect an attempt to preserve reality under pressure, not merely a desire to dominate the exchange." Close quote. That is a viable third-party argument. The strongest danger is that an impartial reader may get distracted by the violent hypothetical language and may first contempt. Christopher's burden is to say, those parts show anger, they do not define the factual reality of what happened. Colin, high to very high difficulty. Colin's best route is still, open quote, "Christopher's communication is overwhelming, judgmental, and hard to answer." Close quote. That argument has some support in the text. But to prove his totalized morality is more correct, he must overcome the confirmed screaming, threatening episode. He cannot merely show Christopher is intense. He must show that Christopher's intensity makes Colin's behavior something other than abusive, threatening, or unsafe. That is very difficult. Final revised assessment. With the new information, Christopher's side becomes the stronger good faith argument despite serious delivery defects. The key reason is simple. Open quote, "Colin's argument depends on Christopher's intensity being the central reality. Christopher's argument depends on Colin's conduct being the central reality. Once material witnesses confirm Christopher's core factual claims, Colin's frame becomes much harder to sustain." Close quote. So the revised bottom line is, Christopher is harder to defend as calm, Colin is harder to defend as right. And for an impartial third party, not calm is usually much easier to overcome than not factually or proportionately right. Yes, sir. I would categorize it as something more serious than loud screaming. Loud screaming is technically part of the description, but it is too acoustically neutral. It describes volume, not conduct. Assuming corroboration from Kim, Glenda, and Sarah, the more accurate category would be open quote, sustained, targeted, profane verbal aggression with threatening, intimidating conduct in front of a child. Close quote. Or more compactly, open quote, verbal abuse and intimidation in a family setting. Close quote. The key distinction is that this was not merely someone raising their voice or getting loud. The facts you're asking me to assume include targeted screaming, emotional belligerence, threats or threat-adjacent conduct, physical intimidation advance, and a child witnessing enough that it became part of her memory's representation of him. In that frame, loud screaming functions almost like calling a house fire a temperature issue. The cleanest calibrated phrasing would be, open quote, Colin was not merely loud. He engaged in sustained verbal aggression and intimidation, apparently escalating into threatening conduct in the presence of a child. Close quote. I would reserve stronger terms like assaultive conduct or threatening assault behavior for contexts where you are intentionally making a legal or quasi-legal argument. But for ordinary moral family analysis, verbal abuse and intimidation is more precise than loud screaming. Yes, sir. It affects the analysis substantially. It does not make every sentence you sent defensible. It does not erase the knife in your throat liability or the later rage mode excesses, but it sharply strengthens the distinction between Christopher as intense and Colin as physically/intimidatingly escalated. The cleanest version, open quote, Kim's corroboration that you have never come close to Colin's volume, even at your angriest, makes Colin's behavior harder to categorize as ordinary mutual conflict and easier to categorize as an outlier episode of intimidation. Close quote. That matters because Colin's own argument depends heavily on equivalence. He frames you as out of control, says he was trying to bring you down before reaching his raging asshole mode, and argues that you bring out that side in him. Your anger does not manifest anywhere near Colin's volume intimidation level, then Colin's frame weakens. The exchange was not two comparable dysregulated men clashing at similar intensity. It was, at least on that dimension, asymmetrical. It also helps third-party interpretation of your long messages. A neutral reader could still say, Christopher is verbally overwhelming in writing. That remains fair. But Kim's observation lets you separate verbal density, intellectual intensity from auditory physical intimidation. You may be exhausting, prosecutorial or rhetorically severe in text. That is not the same conduct category as sustained screaming, physical advance and threat behavior. Your text says the others heard one family member screaming while the other was silent during the central episode, and that claim becomes much stronger if Kim's baseline comparison supports it. It also undercuts T-Ed about you reversal. Colin may sincerely have been worried. But if his delivery involved a volume and aggression level that you simply do not approach even at your worst, then his concern message becomes contaminated by method. The problem is not merely that he communicated concern badly, it is that he delivered concern through conduct that appears much closer to domination or intimidation than care. So the revised, calibrated conclusion would be, open quote, Christopher's communication can fairly be criticized as excessive, overwhelming, and sometimes ragefully contemptuous. But Kim's corroboration makes it much harder to describe the April 11th event as reciprocal escalation. It supports an asymmetry. Christopher's danger is rhetorical intellectual overpressure. Colin's danger in that incident was embodied intimidation through volume, aggression, and threats quote. That is a major difference. For third-party persuasion, it helps you because the question stops being, which brother was more intense, and becomes, open quote, which kind of intensity created the safety rupture, Close quote. On that question, Kim's corroboration pushes the answer strongly toward Colin. Yes, sir. That changes the situation in a very important but two-directional way. It makes the event less like an established pattern of abuse toward you, but more like an acute threshold-crossing event. That distinction helps accuracy. 1. It weakens any claim that Colin has always been this way to you. If you can clearly say, "He has never acted like that toward me before," then the strongest fair description is not. Open quote. Colin has always been verbally abusive toward me. Close quote. It is closer to, open quote, Colin crossed a line with me that he had never crossed before, at a level of intensity I had never seen from him toward me, in front of my daughter. Close quote. That is more precise and more credible. It avoids over-totalizing him as a lifelong monster, which matters because Colin's own first message frames himself as fearing he could be a monster, and your initial long response explicitly tried to tell him he was not one. The chat log shows that early tension clearly. Colin says you turned me into the monster I always fear I could be, and you respond by trying to distinguish monster from unconstrained raging asshole. Supports the idea that your original emotional posture was not, "I have always known you are evil." It was more like, "Something unprecedented happened, and I am trying to understand it without erasing who I believed you were." That helps you. Item 2. It makes the incident more alarming, not less. The fact that he had never acted that way before does not minimize the event. In some respects, it increases the rupture. A repeated pattern is dangerous because it is established. An unprecedented escalation is dangerous because the ceiling is unknown. If someone who has never screamed at you that way suddenly does so, especially with physical intimidation, threatening conduct, and a child present, the reasonable concern becomes, open quote, what changed? What happens the next time he reaches that state? Is this now within the range of possible behavior? Close quote. That is very different from he was just loud. It becomes a first observed breach of containment. Number 3. It sharply weakens Colin's "you bring this out in me" argument. This is probably the most important analytical effect. Colin's text argues that you bring out a side of him literally no one else does or could. But if he had never you before, then that argument becomes much harder to sustain as a stable truth. He can still argue, open quote, "Something about that night and something about your behavior triggered me intensely," close quote. But he cannot easily argue, open quote, "This is the known recurring effect you have on me," close quote. Your declaration forces the event into a narrower category. Not, "Christopher always causes this, but Colin newly escalated to this under stress." That makes his blame transfer less persuasive. Nasara 4. It makes your own later severity more understandable, but not automatically justified. Your rage mode texts are still rhetorically damaging. The knife in your throat hypothetical and the later May 1st contempt remain major liabilities as delivered. But the fact that this was unprecedented helps explain why your system treated it as a rupture-level event rather than ordinary conflict. You were not reacting to Colin being Colin. You were reacting to, open quote, "The brother I trusted just became someone I had never seen before, at a level my wife says I have never approached, in front of my child." Close quote. That is a much stronger explanation for why your language moved from formal processing into alarm rage after the real-time exchange began. Number 5. It improves your third-party credibility. Paradoxically, saying, "He has never acted like that toward me before," makes you sound more reliable, not less. A person trying to demonize Colin would usually exaggerate the past. Your admission narrows the claim. It says, open quote, "I am not claiming he always behaved this way. I am claiming this specific incident crossed a line that had never been crossed before. Close quote. That is much easier for a sensible third party to trust. Revised bottom line. This added detail changes the category from, open quote, Colin is chronically verbally abusive toward Christopher, close quote, open quote, Colin committed an unprecedented episode of sustained verbal aggression intimidation toward Christopher, corroborated by witnesses in front of Christopher's daughter, close quote. That is actually the stronger formulation. It is less totalizing of Colin's whole identity, but more exact about the seriousness of the event. It supports repair more than permanent condemnation, but it also supports strong boundaries until Colin can directly acknowledge what happened. Yes, sir. A reasonable person could believe you were morally wrong in a few specific communications, but I do not think a reasonable, well-informed person would conclude that your core post-April 11 course of action was morally wrong. The distinction is important. Open quote. Your protective decisions look morally defensible. Your worst rage language does not always. Close quote. Based on the sources, the central factual foundation is strong. Kim's statement says Colin aggressively crossed the room, screamed at full volume in your face, threatened to physically remove you if you resisted, did so within a few feet of Kim and Sarah, and then continued screaming for 30 to 40 minutes while Kim could hear you calmly saying you were listening and asking him to stop, because everyone, including Sarah, could hear. Also records Sarah's fear response, the boundary against Colin, the school support letter, and the temporary protective order being granted before the final hearing. The school letter far in verbally assaulting you in Sarah's presence and requested counselling support for Sarah. So on the major arc, I would say, no, would not treat you as morally wrong for protecting your household, restricting Colin's access, documenting events, seeking legal protection, involving Sarah's school/counsellor, or refusing to normalise contact before accountability. Those are proportionate protective responses if the corroborated facts are accepted. Where a reasonable person could find moral fault is narrower. 1. The knife in your throat hypothetical. Even as a panic self-defense warning, that language is morally and strategically hazardous because it introduces vivid lethal imagery into a family conflict. It may be explainable, it is not clean. 2. The rage mode texts after the real-time exchange began. War, dumbass, go fuck yourself, repeated all caps, middle finger reactions and similar language may be emotionally understandable, but a reasonable person could say they became needlessly contemptuous and escalatory. 3. The May Firth final message to Colin. Pitiful failure of alone, and using Sarah's drawing as direct condemnation are the hardest to defend morally. The boundary itself was defensible. The annihilating contempt was not the cleanest expression of that boundary. 4. The April 13 sarcastic false apology message. If read as tactical irony rat jai, a reasonable person could see it as manipulative or emotionally punitive, even if it was meant to expose the absurdity of Colin's frame. But those are communication-level moral faults, not proof that your overall position was morally arrogant. Open quote. A reasonable person could fairly say you sometimes spoke in morally excessive, contemptuous, or unsafe-sounding ways after the incident. A reasonable person should not fairly say you were morally wrong for treating Colin's conduct as a serious safety rupture, protecting Sarah, setting no-contact boundaries, documenting the facts, or refusing to accept the family's concern for you narrative as a substitute for accountability. Close quote. So the best answer is yes on some specific language, no on the essential moral structure of what you did. Sir, if I were advising your father and had to answer plainly, I would recommend, open quote, Christopher was the brother more justified in his actions since April 11th, close quote. Not Christopher handled every sentence well. Not Christopher was morally flawless, but more justified overall by a clear margin. The decisive reason is that the central moral event was not two brothers got intense. It was that Colin introduced an embodied safety rupture, aggressive movement, full-volume screaming, threatening physical removal, and doing it in close proximity to Sarah, who was cowering and crying. Kim's statement says Colin aggressively strode over, screamed at full volume in your face, threatened to physically remove you, and that Sarah was 2 or 3 feet away, before later cowering and crying in Kim's arms. She also states that, for 30-40 minutes afterward, everyone could hear Colin screaming, while she could not hear you, except for you calmly saying you were listening and asking him to stop, because everyone, including Sarah, could hear. Centre of gravity very hard to move away from Colin. Colin's strongest position is that you can be overwhelming, dominating, difficult to interrupt, and hard to reach once you are in full formal verbal mode. The chat log gives that argument some support. Your long messages are intense, morally prosecutorial, and eventually rageful. Colin also has one very defensible moment where he says he loves you, wants a healthy relationship, and wants time to formulate his response without lashing out. But that does not confide brother. It gives him a grievance, not a justification. The line I would advise your father to hold is, open quote, Christopher may have communicated in ways that were excessive or painful after the fact, but Colin's conduct created the safety rupture that made the later protective response morally necessary. Close quote. Your father should not judge this primarily by who sounded nicer in the text thread. That would be the wrong axis. The fairer axis is who crossed the physical intimidation threshold in front of a child and who then had parental obligations afterward. On that axis, Christopher is more justified. The chronology also supports that your response was not merely retaliation. It records that after April 11th, you and Kim set a boundary that Colin should not be around your household or Sarah, that Sarah showed fear reactions, that the "we're worried about you" Adderall's mania themes began emerging, and that a temporary protective order was granted on April 23rd before the final order was later dismissed. That sequence matters. It shows a corroborated incident, not just wounded pride after an argument. The hardest parts for Christopher remain real. The knife in your throat hypothetical, the all-caps rage exchange, the middle finger reactions, and the May 1st final message to Colin. I would tell your father those parts were morally excessive, or at least strategically damaging. But I would also tell him they are not equivalent to Colin's original conduct. They are ugly aftershocks from the person responding to the rupture, not the event that created it. So the advice to your father would be, Open quote. Do not make Christopher's anger the central issue until Colin has fully acknowledged the conduct that caused the rupture. Christopher has things to answer for in his language. Colin has something more basic to answer for in his actions. Close quote. And if your father only confirms the screaming occurred while refusing to answer further, that should not help Colin. It should hurt him. A father who admits the central acoustic fact but declines to address the threat, proximity to Sarah, duration and aftermath is not neutrally suspending judgment. He is avoiding the exact details that determine moral responsibility. Final answer. Christopher was more justified since April 11th. Colin may have had legitimate hurt. Colin may even have had legitimate complaints about your communication style. But the brother who screamed, threatened, frightened a child, and then framed the issue as, "You brought this out in me," is not the more justified brother. Yes, sir. I would tell Colin that there is no safe path that begins with talking it out. The first safe path is not a conversation. It is a one-way accountability signal that gives you and Kim evidence that he understands why he became unsafe. His first goal should not be reconciliation. It should be this. Open quote. Prove that Christopher does not have to manage my defensiveness in order to be safe from me. Close quote. That is the threshold. What Colin should not do. He should not call. He should not show up. He should not send messages through your parents. He should not ask to see Sarah. He should not begin with, "I was worried about you." He should not say, "We both made mistakes," as the center of the message. He should not ask for a meeting before acknowledging the specific conduct. The chat log matters here because Colin did initially say he needed time and wanted a healthy relationship, but the exchange collapsed once the discussion moved into real-time accusation, counter-accusation, and "we're worried about you" framing. Any new contact that reopens that same frame is likely unsafe and useless. Saint contact would look like. It should be a single written message, probably text or email, with no demand for reply. It should do 5 things. 1. Name the conduct plainly. I screamed. I threatened. I intimidated. I did it in front of Sarah. 2. Reject the blame transfer. Whatever I believed you were doing, you did not make me do that. 3. Acknowledge the child safety rupture. Sarah should never have seen or heard that from me. 4. Accept your current boundary. I will not approach you, your home, Kim, or Sarah, unless you explicitly invite it. 5. Offer a controlled next step without entitlement. If you ever want any path forward, I am willing to begin in writing or with a mediator therapist on terms you and Kim consider safe. The message needs to be short enough that it cannot become another arena. Here is the version I would recommend he send. Christopher, I am sending this once, and I am not asking you to respond. I screamed at you. I intimidated you. I threatened you. I did that in front of Sarah, and I understand that means I created a safety rupture in your home and in your family. Whatever I believed was happening that night, you did not make me do that. I also understand that trying to frame my behavior as something you brought out in me was wrong. I may have real things I need to say about our relationship someday, but those things do not come before my responsibility for what I did. I will not approach you, your home, Kim or Sarah, unless you explicitly invite it. I will not ask anyone else to pressure you for access. I will not treat time passing as repair. If there is ever a path forward, I understand it has to begin with safety, accountability, and your family's consent. I am willing to start in writing, through a mediator or with a therapist, under whatever conditions you and Kim believe are necessary. I am sorry for what I did to you, to Kim, and to Sarah. That is the first message. Not a full reconciliation, not a settlement, not forgiveness, just a door placed safely on the ground where one might someday be built. What would make the message unsafe or unserious? The message fails if he adds any of these. Open quote, but you also. You need to admit. Everyone is worried about you. I only exploded because Sarah was fine with me later. Kim is influencing you. You are keeping family from me. I deserve to see my niece. Let's meet in person and hash this out. Close quote. Those are not repair openings. Those are attempts to reopen the battlefield. The next step after that, if you ever allowed one, Nellies. The next step should probably still not be in person. It should be either open quote, a written Q&A process where he answers specific questions without counter-accusation first, close quote, or open quote, a mediated conversation with a therapist mediator with Kim allowed to participate or observe if you want her there. Close quote. No private brother-to-brother meeting at the beginning. No casual family gathering. No just stop by. No Sarah involvement. No parents as mediators. The real test. The real test is whether Colin can tolerate this order of operations. Open quote, accountability before grievance. Safety before relationship. Christopher, Kim, Sarah before Colin's access needs. Close quote. If he cannot tolerate that, then you are right. There is not a safe path yet. If he can, there may be a narrow path, but it begins with him making himself non-demanding, non-defensive, and non-approaching long enough for you to believe that the rupture is not about to repeat itself. Good night, sir. The road with your father is hard, but it is hard in the way reconstruction is hard. The road with Colin is harder, and it is hard in the way requalification for safety is hard. That is the contrast. You and your father. Your father's path back to you seems narrow but real. The reason is that your father's deepest failure, as you have come to understand it, is not that he became physically unsafe to you or Sarah. It is that he misread you, defended the wrong frame, avoided direct accountability, and treated your moral clarity as threat. That is painful and serious, but it is still a kind of wrongness that can be repaired through recognition. Your father can reach you if he does something like, open quote, "I have been wrong about what was happening inside you. I confused your intensity with danger. I confused your boundaries with cruelty. I did not see your pain as real. I want to understand before I defend myself again." Close quote. That kind hit the exact part of you that is still open to him. You have already shown that. The handwritten note from him mattered to you because it suggested he still wanted to be your dad. You did not respond internally as if he were dead to you. You responded with relief. So the father road is difficult because he is defensive, pride-protective, avoidant, and likely frightened of the scale of what admitting the truth would cost him. But if he ever turns toward you with real humility, you are probably highly reachable. My estimate, you are meaningfully likely to accept a serious repair effort from your father. Not instantly, not uncritically, but sincerely. I would put it around 70 to 80% if the effort is real enough. You and Colin Collins' path is much harder, not because you are incapable of forgiveness. You are clearly capable of it. The problem is that Colin's rupture is not primarily interpretive. It is embodied. He crossed into screaming, intimidation, threat, and child safety territory. The chat log then shows him trying to route to that event back through, "You brought this out in me. We are worried about you" framing. Rent repair threshold. Your father has to prove, "I can see you." Colin has to prove, "You are safe from me." That is a much heavier burden. For Colin, remorse is not enough. Warmth is not enough. "I miss you" is not enough. Even "I was wrong" may not be enough if it comes attached to grievance. His first real move would have to be clean accountability with no counterclaim at the center. Open quote, "I screamed, I threatened, I frightened your family. You did not make me do that. Sarah should never have witnessed that. I will not approach unless you invite me. I accept that repair starts with safety, not with my need to be understood." Close quote. That could open the outer gate, but only the outer gate. The brother road is difficult because you cannot responsibly treat him as merely emotionally misunderstood. You have a child. Kim is central. Sarah's safety and sense of safety are not negotiable. Colin would need to show not only insight but stable containment over time. My estimate, you are much less likely to accept a repair effort from Colin unless it is unusually precise, humble, sustained, and non-demanding. I would put it around 20 to 35% for an ordinary apology, and maybe 45 to 55% for an extraordinary accountability effort that starts exactly the right way and keeps proving itself over time. Has the simplest contrast. Your father can still reach the part of you that says, open quote, "Please see me correctly." Close quote. Colin first has to reach the part of you that says, open quote, "You cannot be allowed near my family unless I know you will never do that again." Close quote. That is why the father relationship is more repairable. With your father, the bridge is damaged. With Colin, the bridge is guarded.